Hello everyone. So in my last video I did a spoiler-free review of 3 Hopes, and I said in my next video I give my thoughts on the story. So I'm going to do a ranking of the 3 story paths, Scarlet Blaze, Azure Gleam, and Golden Wildfire, to see which one's the best and see what they went wrong and where they went right. This is kind of a sequel video to a video I posted a couple months ago ranking the routes in 3 houses, so if you want to check that out before watching this one, the link is in the description. So how I'm going to rank the 3 routes is based 1 on the battles, how fun and memorable they are, and how much strategy they implement. But since 3 Hopes is predominantly a hack and slash game, I will not put the routes down a peg if they don't have super in-depth strategy. Second, I will look through the side characters and see if their inclusion makes the route interesting, and if they help out the main lord. Thirdly, I will look at how well the main characters are utilized, how strong they are, and how interesting their arcs and storylines are. Finally, I will see if the story makes improvements on its 3 houses counterpart, and if it's interesting and unique. Finally, there will be spoilers for 3 Hopes and 3 houses, so if you have not played the routes of 3 Hopes, be warned. And finally, if you liked the video here today, like and subscribe for more Fire Emblem content in the future. And without any further ado, let's get into the ranking of the 3 routes in Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes. Golden Wildfire starts off our list, and to give my thoughts on the battles, I think for the most part they are very good. I think the standout battles here are the final fight at the Tailtean Plains, the Invasion of Ferdinand battle, and the battle of Gronder Field against Byleth and Count Burgles. I really like the Gronder Field map because instead of just going straight at the enemy commanders, you have to lead them each to a trap, so you can do damage to them without them doing damage to you, and so you can do what you need to do without them interfering. Sure, they do the same thing in Azure Gleam with Byleth and the Death Knight, but I like it more here because you have a cutscene that plays when you lock in Holst with Count Burgles, the fact that I like the locale more, and it's just more memorable to me in general. The Invasion of Ferdinand chapter was really fun just because it was pretty decently challenging. It was a memorable part of the story, and it had a cutscene to go along with it, and fights against Dimitri are pretty fun in general. Finally, the final battle against Freya at the Tailtean Plains is probably the best chapter in the game, for a couple of reasons. Number 1 is the only final chapter in 3 Hopes that does not take place at Garreg-Mach Monastery. Number 2, obviously since it's the final battle, is very climactic. Number 3, the battle against Freya at the end of the chapter is very fun. It's definitely not the best Freya chapter, because Freya is also the final boss in one of the other routes, but the fight here is very serviceable. Start off just by fighting her in her Saros outfit, and then after you beat that, she turns into the Immaculate one. Still, this probably has the worst final boss in my opinion. It's not that this one's bad, it's actually really good, it's just the other 2 are so much better. Fourthly, the song that accompanies this final battle is probably my favorite song from the game that's not originally from 3 houses. Overall, the battles in Golden Wildfire are pretty good. I wouldn't call them the most tactically interesting battles ever, but I feel like there are some pretty memorable battles here, and all the battles are pretty good nonetheless. Moving on to the side characters, the Golden Deer's involvement is definitely more involved here in Golden Wildfire than it was in Verdant Wind. They all actually do stuff and contribute to the main story, rather than Verdant Wind, when all they felt like they did was show up to the war councils. Sure, they had paralogs and some select dialogue in some of the chapters, but other than that, that's kinda all they really did, at least to me. But here I can actually go through some of the side characters and see what they did in the story. For example, Holst has a rivalry dynamic with Count Burgles in the story, mostly culminating in a duel between them. Lysithea and Marianne are good because they represent their fathers at the round table and give their thoughts on what they should do. Hilda, obviously being the second command to Claude, is also given a lot of screen time here. Finally, in my opinion, Lawrence is probably given the most attention because he has a whole dynamic with his father in the earlier portions of the game because he thinks that his father betrayed him and joined the Empire, and there is a whole thing where Lawrence launches an investigation on Claude. But not everyone gets a ton of attention. For example, the third-party character you get after completing the prologue, Shamir, isn't really talked about or actually show up in any of the scenes other than the prologue. But for the most part, I definitely think the side characters get a lot more attention in Golden Wildfire than Verdant Wind, which is a plus for me. Claude's role in the story is also a big improvement over Verdant Wind, mostly for his plot lines with the Elmiran Prince Shahid, and the fact that he gets more of his backstory revealed. I mean, the all but confirmed reveal that Claude's name is actually Khalil is already enough to make him better here than he was in Verdant Wind. And the strong hinting that Claude's actual name's Khalil is definitely my favorite moment in Golden Wildfire. And Claude gets a better dynamic with the Elmirans, because he's fighting them in the first half of the game, and the fact that he has to go against his stepbrother, Shahid. Sure, Claude becomes the king of Elmira at the end of Three Houses, but I definitely feel like it's more justified here in Three Hopes because he's given more storylines with the Elmirans. We also get to see a tougher, strong-willed version of Claude that it's not really easy to see in Three Houses. I mean, that side of him is definitely shown in Verdant Wind, but it's definitely easier to see here because he goes on the offensive against Rhea. In Three Houses, he does say that Fodlan would be better without Rhea in power, but then he ends up teaming with her and fighting against Edelgard. But here in Three Hopes, he does the opposite. He sides up with Edelgard and goes on the offensive against Rhea. Whether that is a good or bad thing, I'm not entirely sure, but it definitely is an interesting side of the character. And yeah, I think Claude's role is way better in Golden Wildfire than it is in Verdant Wind. I cannot think of one thing about Claude's role in Verdant Wind that's better than Golden Wildfire. Finally, the story of Golden Wildfire is probably the biggest improvement over Verdant Wind's story. I mean, Verdant Wind's story wasn't bad, but it was basically just a carbon copy of Silver Snow's story, so the fact that Golden Wildfire has a unique plot is just really awesome. But just because this route is better than Verdant Wind doesn't mean it's really good. There are many flaws here, starting with the fact that for most of the game, there's a lack of a main antagonist. Sure, in the first half of the game you kind of are fighting Edelgard and the Empire, but you're mostly just trying to get the land back and protect yourself. The Elmirans, while they help Claude's story, they only show up twice the entire game as a villain, and then they just kind of go off to the sidelines for the rest of the game. Honestly, if they made Claude's stepbrother Shahid the main villain of Golden Wildfire, that would very much help it in my eyes. But then he's killed off halfway through the story to make room for another antagonist, and then the new antagonist, Rhea, barely shows up until the end of the game. I would be fine with Rhea being the villain for the second half of the game if she had more of a prominent role and had more evil dialogue or anything really, but she just kind of shows up and says we're gonna fight, and that's kind of it. So the antagonists who are utilized the best, Edelgard and the Empire, literally end up becoming your allies, so they're not really antagonists to begin with. So literally all the antagonists of Golden Wildfire either show up a couple times before their end of their role in the story, or they literally end up becoming your allies, so that's not really great. On a different note, halfway through the game, the Leicester Alliance changes to the Leicester Federation. And, I mean, cool, I guess it's pretty unique compared to the other routes where they just stay the Alliance, but I'm not really sure where that was coming from. Sure, the leaders of Leicester don't really work well together, but the change to the Federation kind of just makes them feel more like the Kingdom to me. I mean, don't get me wrong, I liked it, and it was an interesting story element, but it didn't really feel as important to me as the game wanted me to think. The last thing I have to say about this route, it's definitely the worst ending to me. I mean, sure, you defeat Rhea and get the Empire and Federation closer to victory, but then suddenly they add in the sudden peace agreement that Claude comes up with that we're not sure if Edelgard and Dimitri are going to sign. I know these endings are supposed to be more open-ended compared to the ones in Three Houses, but this one's kind of too open-ended in my opinion. I mean, the ending in Azure Gleam and the good ending in Scarlet Blaze make you feel like it's definitely coming close to the end of the war, but this one didn't really give me that feeling because those who slither in the dark, the most evil group in Fodlan, is still out there. But there aren't really any major pacing issues, so that makes this route more enjoyable. So even though it might not be the best route ever, it's still a very solid one. Scarlet Blaze is a runner-up on this list, and that pretty much applies to the battles as well. I think if I had to choose my favorite chapters from Scarlet Blaze, I'd probably go with the battle at the Silver Maiden where you fight Ingrid, and both versions of ALL, regardless if you recruit Byleth or not. In the version of ALL where you don't recruit Byleth, I really like it because you have to fend off the Kingdom on the top and the Alliance on the bottom while you're kind of smushed in the middle. And that adds up for a chapter where I kind of have to think more about what I'm going to do, compared to the usual chapters where you just kind of send people and make them do whatever. The version of the ALL battle where you do have Byleth recruited, I really like, because you start out pretty simple, you just trying to advance on the Kingdom, but suddenly once you start fighting Dimitri, Status shows up out of nowhere towards the rear and tries to attack the stronghold you need protected, which on my initial playthrough I didn't see coming. The Silver Maiden chapter against Ingrid was probably my favorite in the route because you have to go through the castle from the inside unlocking it, but if you don't have a flying unit or a cavalry unit, you're going to take damage because of the spike traps, making that probably the most strategic map in the game. So I don't think Scarlet Blaze or Golden Wildfire have a single bad map, but I think Scarlet Blaze gets the edge a little bit just because Golden Wildfire has less strategy in its chapters. Moving on to the side characters, I think the Black Eagles have the overall best involvement in the route compared to the other houses in their routes, but yet again, that does not apply to the third-party characters that join you after the prologue. But it might even be worse this time around because you get two characters, Manuel and Yuritsa, instead of just one like in Golden Wildfire. They don't talk in any main story cutscenes after the prologue, even though, especially with Yuritsa, you'd think someone like the Death Knight would be an important character. But no, as soon as you recruit them, they just kind of stand around your camp and do nothing. And sure, you can say, they're recruitable units, so obviously it makes sense that they're not going to do as much as the main cast. And sure, they technically are recruitments, but Manuela is only possible to be played in Scarlet Blaze. But even some recruitable units like Lawrence and Lysithea actually do stuff in the main story after they're recruited. But this lack of doing anything does not apply to the Black Eagles. The Black Eagles are very involved in the story, especially with Ferdinand and Hubert, who have their own separate storyline. Throughout the game, Ferdinand has to grasp with his father being in jail for crimes against the Empire, and once his father escapes from jail, he has to bring it upon himself to defeat him. And sure, it's not the most complicated storyline ever, but it definitely adds to the story quite a bit. Other characters that get spotlight, Bernadetta, Linhardt, and Caspar, feel a lot more important here than they did in Crimson Flower and Silver Snow, since their fathers were more in the picture. And Monica? I'll save her for a future video. So with all the side characters having a pretty decent role in the story outside of Manuel and Yuritsa, I'm very happy with it. Compared to Dimitri and Claude, Edelgard's characterization and general role in the story is very similar to how it was in Crimson Flower. That's definitely not a bad thing, as in Three Houses, Edelgard probably had the second best character arc out of all the characters. I guess the biggest difference in her role here compared to Crimson Flower is that she's more adamant about not wanting to kill Rhea, whereas in Three Houses, the only hinting of that is in a potential question you can get while teaching, whereas here it's stated multiple times throughout the main story. There is a little minor gripe I can bring up here though. In the beginning of the game, after being Talus for the first time, Chez tries to give Edelgard a high five and she doesn't do it, and then suddenly at the end of the game, once you beat Rhea and Talus, boom, high five time. I mean, sure, that's a little bit of character development, but it's so minor and I didn't really think that was that big of a deal. But like I said before, that's a very minor thing, as it doesn't really negatively impact the story anyway. The story of Scarlet Blaze is pretty good for the most part. It does have a villain problem, but not in the same essence as Golden Wildfire. In Golden Wildfire, the issue I had with it was the lack of a main villain, as it kept cycling through villains constantly. Here, the main villains are pretty much Rhea and Talus for the entire game, but they don't really show up that much. Sure, Rhea has a couple scenes she's in, but especially with Talus, they never show up. Talus I can understand as he's a member of a very secretive organization, but Rhea was such a good villain in Crimson Flower, and to see her not really show up much in Scarlet Blaze is kinda disappointing to me. It's not like she doesn't show up at all during Scarlet Blaze. She shows up during the Battle of Garreg Mach, and she has a couple scenes where she talks to Dimitri, but compared to Crimson Flower where she's like very much in it, it's kind of disappointing to me. Their actual role aside, choosing Rhea and Talus to be the main villains of Scarlet Blaze is a somewhat improvement over Crimson Flower, as Edelgard is not forced to team up with those who float in the dark, but since neither villain is really built up enough, it doesn't really feel justified. Moving on to some positive things, I really like how they implemented the Claude-Edelgard team-up in this route. About halfway through the game, Claude and Edelgard team up to destroy the kingdom and Rhea, and depending if you recruit Byleth or not, it goes down one of two ways. If you recruit Byleth, Claude stays loyal to Edelgard and we get a better ending. If not, Claude betrays Edelgard and we get a worse ending. And I really think that's cool, giving more incentive to recruit Byleth. One of my favorite things about this route is that Edelgard's academy plan, where she slowly plans to go to war against the church, gets changed because Chez shows up, which is a nice difference to Crimson Flower. There's a plotline that goes throughout Scarlet Blaze where Hubert and Edelgard don't really trust Chez because of his likely connection to the Agarthans. And sure, that plotline is also in Azure Gleam, but I think it makes more sense here because Hubert and Edelgard make more sense to not trust Chez than to do, because Hubert's personality is largely of him being untrusting of people. And overall, it's a solid plotline. So like I alluded to before, there are two possible endings whether you recruit Byleth or not. And what's the same about both the endings is that Rhea and Talus attack each other and destroy the bridge, and it's not really clear if they died or not. I mean, it's really not that big of a deal, but it kind of bothered me because if Byleth can survive falling into that pit, why can't Rhea or Talus? Then it splits into one of two different endings, depending on if you recruit Byleth or not. The bad ending is obviously the worst ending in the game, but that's not a bad thing since it's supposed to be a bad ending. It shows the three major leaders of Fodlan still going to war at each other with no end in sight. The other ending is obviously better because you recruit Byleth and Claude doesn't betray you. It shows that Claude and Edelgard are really close to defeating Dimitri because they're pressuring him into a corner, which in my opinion is probably the best outcome in the game, since the other routes it is possible for the other side to come back after the game is over, but here it seems very unlikely, at least to me. Altogether, Scarlet Blaze is a really good route. It might not be my favorite in Three Hopes, but it's definitely comparable to Crimson Flower. Azure Gleam, in my opinion, has slightly better battles than Scarlet Blaze. Choosing my favorite battles, the battle at ALL, again, is one of my favorites here. The battle at Arianode, the battle at Garreg Mach, and the early chapter where you escort Rhea. The main reason I like the Escort Rhea chapter is because it's fun not to just go through different strongholds. Sure, you're kind of doing that while you're leading Rhea, but for the most part you're just trying to make sure she doesn't die, and then you have to separate your forces to save Catherine, Cyril, and Seta. This chapter might not be the most strategy heavy or the most memorable, but I feel like there's not many escort chapters in the main story in any of the routes, so I'd like to see one here. ALL, like it is in Scarlet Blaze, is an immensely fun chapter, but I feel like it's less fun here, mostly because Edelgard is under amnesia, or something like that, so it's not really as exciting as it is in Scarlet Blaze. Like I said when talking about the battles in Scarlet Blaze, the Arianode chapter is probably the best one here because it's the most strategically challenging battle in the game. My runner-up favorite chapter in Azure Gleam, though, is the battle at Garreg Mach in the final chapter. The location is the same for the final battle between Scarlet Blaze and Azure Gleam, but I like it just a bit more here because I like the final boss, and I like that it has you invading Garreg Mach instead of protecting it like in Scarlet Blaze. To finish this section off, I can't really think of anything negative with the chapters in Azure Gleam. Sure, I didn't really have much negative to say about the chapters in Scarlet Blaze or Golden Wildfire, but I think it's even more prevalent here. I definitely think Azure Gleam has the best set of battles, if not by much. And again, Azure Gleam's side characters are used the best out of the three routes, mostly because the third-party character you get after being the prologue is actually part of the story. You get Rodrigue after being the prologue, and he actually contributes to the story, mostly because he's Felix's dad and Dimitri's father figure. Well, he doesn't contribute as much if you don't recruit Byleth, but for the most part, whether you recruit or don't recruit Byleth, he does a lot. Dedue in Azure Moon was kinda disappointing since he was fake dead for half of part 2, but to see that he's actually here for the entire game is very nice. Sylvain's character gets a lot of attention, but he's also a lot more serious than he was in Three Houses, which may or may not be a good thing, because in Three Houses, Sylvain was a very likable character, and he does get character development here in Three Hopes because of it, but that also kind of takes away from some of his character. Annette is the last character I want to bring up here because Felix and Ingrid are very similar to how they were in Three Houses, which is a good thing. It's not like she doesn't do anything like Manuela and Yuritsa and Shamir, but it's not like she's a big role like Ferdinand or Hubert. And maybe it's just me, but I feel like she's more prominent as a minor villain in the other two routes than she is as a supporting character in Azure Gleam. But even with Annette's role being somewhat disappointing to a small degree, I still think the side characters in Azure Gleam are substantially better than the ones in the other two routes. Similar to Three Houses, Dimitri in my opinion gets the best character arc here. One criticism I had of Azure Moon in Three Houses was that Paulus was technically defeated in the route, but he was defeated as Lord Arundel, so there was no big reveal for Dimitri. And outside of Talus being defeated as Arundel, there is literally no defeating of the Those Who Slither in the Dark outside of a potential paired ending with Dimitri and Happy, even though they're literally the ones that started the tragedy of Duscur in Azure Moon. To see Dimitri be more involved in fighting him is very nice. Now, Edelgard and Claude have very similar roles to what they did in Three Houses here, but Dimitri is completely different. See, in Three Houses, after time skip, Dimitri goes insane after learning that Edelgard is the Flame Emperor, which leads into an arc of him learning to let go of his past. In Three Hopes, since there is no Flame Emperor, Dimitri does not go down the insane path. That's a nice difference to Azure Moon. And since Dimitri's character arc is probably my favorite thing about Azure Moon, you expect me not to like his character arc here, but I don't personally mind it. He still learns to let go of his past to a small degree, and he learns to trust his friends, so it's still a pretty nice arc here. Finally, the story of Azure Gleam is absolutely amazing. The villain here in Azure Gleam is Talus, and that's exactly who I want to be the final boss in Azure Moon. Sure, Edelgard was a cool and interesting main villain, but I would have preferred it to be Talus because he's connected to Dimitri as he impersonated his uncle, and he's one of the leaders in the tragedy of Duscur. So to see Talus as the main villain was really cool. Sure, he doesn't personally show up that much, but he does mind control Edelgard, and she is a constant presence throughout the game, so I didn't personally mind him being on the sidelines. And this is the only route in the game where Rhea is not the main antagonist, so it definitely helps it stand out compared to the other routes. And speaking of Rhea, I really like how the Church of Saros are involved in the story. They do enough in the story to make them feel like they're actually there, but they don't do too much where they end up taking over the route and making it feel more like a church route than a kingdom route, which is a problem I had with Verdant Wind in Three Houses. I also really like the new lore details we get about the Agarthans and the tragedy of Duscur. For example, we get to learn that Cornelius' name's actually Cleobulus, and we learn that Edelgard's mother Anselma is not actually secretly alive. The ending of Azure Gleam, in my opinion, is probably the happiest in the game, as Claude and Dimitri retake Garrick Mach, defeating Talus and managing to spare Edelgard, and that probably means that Dimitri's torment for the tragedy of Duscur can likely end. There are so many callbacks to Azure Moon that I love in this route, especially in the final cutscene. The fact that Edelgard calls Dimitri D, the fact that they're standing in similar poses to how they were at the ending of Azure Moon, and the final scene you see in Azure Gleam is a shot of a moon in the sky. Stuff like that is really cool for me, and that's probably why I like this route so much. But even though I do like it so much and it is number 1 on this list, that does not mean it doesn't come without some criticisms. The biggest criticism I have of this route is the sudden disappearance of Ferdinand and Hubert. Once Edelgard starts getting time controlled, it jumps to time skip, and that's the last time we ever see Ferdinand or Hubert, and it never gets explained what happened. Sure, Edelgard getting mind controlled isn't necessarily my favorite, but the fact is that there isn't really any other way to make sure that none of the lords die at the end of the game, like in the other 2 routes. But the fact that Hubert and Ferdinand don't show up at all after part 1's over doesn't really sit well with me. Sure, Leonie and Lysithea also don't show up at all in Azure Gleam, but those are somewhat minor characters that they could do the story without, but Ferdinand and Hubert are literally the number 2s to Edelgard. But with all that being said, Azure Gleam is still an amazing route and definitely deserving of the number 1 on this list. Most of the routes in Three Hopes I wouldn't say are as good as their Three Houses counterparts, but they are still really good and add a lot to the story of Fodlan. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching this video. This video was really fun to make and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you're curious what my next video is, I will be doing a support conversation ranking of all the supports for Edelgard in both Three Houses and Three Hopes, so I really hope you look forward to that. I predominantly do Fire Emblem content on this channel, but after it releases on the Switch, I plan on doing a video on Persona 5 Royal eventually, so I hope you look forward to that as well. But that's it for me. Again, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all next time.